My name is Margaret, and I'm 28 years old. 6 months ago, my grandmother Eleanor passed away, leaving me nothing but a simple silver ring with what looked like a piece of glass in the center. Everyone who saw it assumed it was worthless costume jewelry, but I wore it every day anyway, because it was all I had left of her. The metal had a dull, tarnished appearance, and the stone was so clear, it seemed fake to anyone who glanced at it. People would often make comments about how I should invest in real jewelry, instead of wearing something so obviously cheap. I never imagined that one ordinary dinner would change my life forever. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't believe what happened when a professional jeweler finally took a close look at my grandmother's ring. I worked as a marketing coordinator at a small firm in Portland, Oregon, making barely enough to cover my studio apartment rent and student loans. My boss Craig was one of those middle-aged men who loved to show off his expensive watch and luxury car, constantly reminding everyone how successful he was. The office environment was competitive, and I often felt like I didn't quite fit in with my coworkers who seemed to have more money and confidence than I did. My relationship with my family had always been complicated. My parents divorced when I was 16, and both of them were too busy rebuilding their lives to pay much attention to me. The only person who truly understood me was my grandmother Eleanor, a graceful woman in her 80s who had immigrated from England decades ago. She lived in a modest apartment filled with old photographs and vintage furniture, and she always carried herself with an elegance that seemed to come from another era. Eleanor used to tell me fascinating stories about her youth in England, tales that seemed almost too extraordinary to be true. She would speak about grand estates, elaborate parties, and mysterious family connections that sounded like something out of a fairy tale. As a child, I loved these stories, but as I grew older, I assumed they were just the romantic imaginings of an elderly woman looking back on her life through rose-colored glasses. The ring had always been part of Eleanor's daily wardrobe. She wore it on her right hand, and whenever I asked about it, she would simply say it was a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations. The setting was clearly old-fashioned, with intricate metalwork that suggested it had been crafted many decades ago. But the tarnished silver in what appeared to be a simple piece of cut glass made it look like something you might find at a thrift store. When Eleanor died last year, I was heartbroken. She had been my anchor, the one person who believed in me unconditionally. Her funeral was small, attended mostly by neighbors, and a few distant relatives I barely knew. After the service, her lawyer handed me a sealed envelope containing a brief note in Eleanor's familiar handwriting that simply read, "This belongs to you now, my dear. Please keep it safe." Inside the envelope was the ring. I had been wearing it every day since then, partly to honor her memory, and partly because it gave me comfort during a difficult time in my life. My coworkers at the marketing firm would occasionally comment on it, usually in a condescending way that made me feel self-conscious about my appearance. Sandra, a woman in her early 30s who worked in accounts, was particularly vocal about her opinions on fashion, and seemed to take pleasure in pointing out what she considered to be other people's poor choices. My financial situation was becoming increasingly stressful. The marketing firm paid barely above minimum wage, and I had been considering taking on weekend work to make ends meet. My personal life wasn't much better. I had ended a long-term relationship 8 months earlier, and dating in Portland felt impossible when I could barely afford to go out for coffee, let alone dinner at the trendy restaurants that seemed to be everywhere. Despite all these challenges, wearing Eleanor's ring gave me a sense of connection to something larger than my current circumstances. Sometimes I would catch myself twisting it around my finger during stressful meetings or difficult phone calls, and it would remind me of my grandmother's quiet strength and dignity. I had no idea that this simple piece of jewelry would soon become the catalyst for the most extraordinary evening of my life. The company dinner was held at Meridian, one of Portland's upscale restaurants downtown, to celebrate landing a significant new client. I had spent my last $40 on dry cleaning my only decent black dress, hoping to look professional enough to fit in with my more affluent colleagues. The restaurant had exposed brick walls, dim lighting, and the kind of atmosphere that made you feel underdressed no matter what you wore. Our table was in a semi-private alcove near the back of the restaurant. Craig had ordered expensive wine for everyone and was holding court at the head of the table, regaling us with stories about his negotiation tactics with a new client. Sandra sat across from me, wearing what looked like a designer blouse and a necklace that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Kevin, our department head, was busy scrolling through his phone between courses, occasionally chiming in with comments about quarterly projections. The evening started pleasantly enough. The wine helped everyone relax, and for once, I felt like I was part of the team rather than just an observer. We were discussing weekend plans when Sandra suddenly grabbed my hand as I reached for my water glass. Her attention had been caught by Eleanor's ring, which was reflecting the candlelight from our table. "Margaret, I've been meaning to ask you about this ring," Sandra said, holding my hand up to examine it more closely. "It has such an interesting vintage look. Where did you get it?" Her tone was friendly, but there was something in her eyes that made me cautious. I had learned to recognize that particular expression from years of dealing with people who enjoyed finding flaws in others. I explained that it had belonged to my grandmother, who had recently passed away. Everyone at the table expressed appropriate condolences, and I felt a warmth of acceptance that I rarely experienced in professional settings. Craig leaned over to get a better look at the ring, and Kevin actually put down his phone to listen to the conversation. "It's really beautiful," I said, looking down at the ring myself. "My grandmother always said it was a family heirloom. She wore it every day for as long as I can remember." Sandra continued to examine it closely, turning my hand this way and that to catch the light. The stone was completely clear and reflected the restaurant's ambient lighting in a way that created small rainbows on the white tablecloth. Then Sandra's expression began to change. What had started as polite interest gradually shifted into something that looked more like skeptical amusement. She released my hand and sat back in her chair with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know, Margaret, I hate to break it to you, but this looks exactly like costume jewelry. The stone is obviously glass, and that setting looks like something you'd find at a dollar store." The conversation at our table suddenly became very quiet. Craig stopped mid-sentence in whatever story he had been telling, and Kevin looked up from his phone with interest. I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment, but I tried to maintain my composure. "Well, it might not be valuable in monetary terms, but it means a lot to me because it was my grandmother's," I said, attempting to steer the conversation away from the ring's worth. But Sandra wasn't finished. "Oh, I'm sure it has sentimental value, honey, but you should know that your grandmother probably got scammed. I've seen rings exactly like this at those mall kiosks that sell fake jewelry to tourists. The setting is decent quality, but that stone is definitely just cut glass. You can tell because real diamonds have a different kind of sparkle." She turned to Craig for support. "Don't you think so, Craig? Look how it reflects the light." "That's not how a real diamond behaves." Craig nodded sagely, as if he were some kind of expert on precious stones. "Margaret, you really should consider investing in some real jewelry. I mean, there's nothing wrong with sentimental pieces, but when you're trying to build a professional image, these details matter. People notice these things, especially clients." His tone was patronizing in the way that made me want to disappear under the table. Kevin chimed in with his own observation. "Yeah, I was wondering about that ring. It does look pretty obviously fake when you know what to look for. I mean, who keeps real diamonds in settings that tarnished? If it were real, someone would have had it cleaned and reset by now." The entire table was now focused on my ring, and I felt like a specimen under a microscope. I wanted to defend Eleanor's memory and explain that she had always taken good care of her possessions, but I found myself at a loss for words. The wine that had made me feel relaxed and social earlier was now making it difficult to think clearly. All I could do was smile awkwardly and hope that the conversation would move on to another topic. Unfortunately, Sandra seemed energized by the attention she was getting from her jewelry analysis. She had positioned herself as the expert at the table, and she was clearly enjoying the role. "You know what, Margaret? I feel terrible that your grandmother got taken advantage of like that. These scam artists specifically target elderly people because they don't know how to spot fake jewelry." Craig was nodding along enthusiastically. "That's so true, Sandra. My ex-wife fell for something similar once. Paid $2,000 for what turned out to be a cubic zirconia ring. It's really sad how these con artists operate." He took another sip of wine and leaned forward conspiratorially. "Margaret, you should definitely get that appraised, just so you know for sure. I mean, there's always a chance it could be worth something, but..." Kevin looked up from his phone again. "Actually, that's not a bad idea. There's a jewelry district downtown with several appraisal shops. We could go after dinner if you want. I'm curious to see what they'd say about it. The suggestion was presented as if it were a fun group activity, but I could hear the underlying assumption that we would all be entertained by watching me learn that my grandmother's ring was worthless. I tried to politely decline, explaining that I didn't really care about the monetary value and that the ring's importance to me was purely emotional. But Sandra was persistent. "Come on, Margaret, it'll be fun. And if I'm wrong, I'll totally apologize. But if I'm right, at least you'll know the truth. Don't you want to know for sure?" The peer pressure at the table was becoming overwhelming. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what I should do, and they were all looking at me expectantly. I realized that refusing to go along with their suggestion would make me look defensive or secretive, which would only fuel more speculation about the ring. Against my better judgment, I agreed to visit a jewelry store after dinner. The restaurant was only a few blocks from the jewelry district, so we decided to walk. The evening air was cool and helped clear my head a little, but I still felt like I was being swept along by forces beyond my control. Sandra walked beside me, continuing to share her theories about how elderly people get scammed by jewelry con artists. Craig and Kevin followed behind us, discussing the best places to get authentic jewelry appraised. Our first stop was a small shop called Golden Gate Jewelers. The store was brightly lit and filled with display cases containing engagement rings and watches. A young woman named Jessica greeted us and asked how she could help. Sandra immediately took charge of the conversation, explaining that we wanted to get my ring appraised. Jessica examined the ring under a small magnifying glass for about 30 seconds before delivering her verdict. "This looks like costume jewelry to me. The setting is decent quality, but that stone is definitely not a diamond. I'd say it's worth maybe $15 to $25, depending on the age and condition of the setting." She handed the ring back to me with a sympathetic smile. "I'm sorry if you were hoping for something more valuable." Sandra could barely contain her satisfaction. "I told you so, Margaret. I mean, I'm sorry your grandmother got ripped off, but at least now you know." Craig and Kevin both looked pleased with themselves, as if they had solved some kind of mystery. I felt humiliated and wanted nothing more than to go home, but Sandra was already suggesting that we get a second opinion. "Let's try one more place, just to be absolutely sure," she said. "There's another jewelry store just down the block. If they say the same thing, then we'll know for certain." I wanted to object, but I felt trapped by the group dynamic. Saying no at this point would make me look like I was in denial about the ring's value, which would only give them more ammunition for future teasing. The second store, Prestige Jewelry, was larger and more upscale than the first. The elderly man behind the counter took slightly longer to examine my ring, but his conclusion was essentially the same. "This appears to be costume jewelry, probably from the 1960s or 70s. The stone is glass, and the setting is silver-plated base metal. It might have some value as a vintage piece, but we're talking about maybe $30 to $40 at most." By this point, I was feeling completely defeated. Two professional jewelers had confirmed what Sandra had been saying all along. My grandmother's precious family heirloom was nothing more than a piece of cheap costume jewelry. The group was starting to lose interest in the whole adventure, and I could sense that they were ready to call it a night and head home. As we walked back toward our cars, Craig mentioned that there was one more jewelry shop still open a few blocks away. "Harold's Fine Jewelry," he said, reading from his phone. "They have good reviews online, and they're open until 9 tonight. It's only 8:30 now, so we could probably make it if we hurry." Sandra seemed less enthusiastic about continuing the jewelry tour, but Kevin said he was curious to get one more professional opinion. Harold's Fine Jewelry was tucked between a used bookstore and a coffee shop on a quiet side street. The storefront was modest and old-fashioned, with a simple sign and display windows that contained a carefully curated selection of vintage pieces. Through the window, I could see an elderly man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses working at a desk in the back of the store. When we entered, a small bell above the door announced our arrival. The man looked up from his work and smiled warmly. He appeared to be in his late 60s, with kind eyes and the deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades working with delicate objects. "Good evening," he said, standing up from his desk. "I'm Harold Zimmerman. How can I help you folks tonight?" Sandra explained our mission, her tone suggesting that this was all just a fun way to end the evening. "We're trying to get this ring appraised," she said, gesturing toward me. "Two other places have already told us it's costume jewelry, but we thought we'd get one more opinion before calling it a night." She seemed confident that Harold would confirm what the previous jewelers had said. Harold nodded politely and extended his hand. "May I take a look?" I removed the ring and placed it in his palm. What happened next was completely unexpected. Harold's casual, friendly demeanor immediately changed. His eyebrows furrowed, and he brought the ring closer to his face, examining it with intense concentration. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to us. He walked over to his workbench and switched on a high-powered lamp with a magnifying attachment. The bright light illuminated the ring in a way that made the stone seem to come alive with sparkles and flashes of color that I had never noticed before. Sandra and Craig exchanged glances that suggested they thought Harold was being overly dramatic. "Sir? 2 other jewelers have already confirmed that it's fake," Sandra said impatiently. "We're just looking for a quick confirmation so we can settle a bet." But Harold wasn't listening to her. He had pulled out a small device that looked like a jeweler's loupe and was examining the ring with even greater intensity. After several minutes of silent examination, Harold slowly placed the ring on his workbench and looked directly at me. His expression was so serious that it made me uncomfortable. "Miss, can you tell me where you acquired this ring?" His voice had a gravity that hadn't been there when we first entered the store. I explained about my grandmother Eleanor, mentioning that she had always said it was a family heirloom. Harold asked for more details about Eleanor's background, particularly her full name, and where she had lived before coming to America. When I told him that her maiden name was Eleanor Whitmore, and that she had emigrated from England in the 1940s, Harold's face went completely pale. He excused himself and disappeared into a back room, returning a few minutes later with several large reference books and what appeared to be a certificate or document of some kind. The atmosphere in the store had become tense, and even Sandra had stopped making skeptical comments. Harold spent several more minutes comparing something in one of his books to my ring, occasionally making small sounds of amazement or disbelief. Finally, Harold set down his magnifying glass and looked at all of us with an expression that I can only describe as stunned. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said slowly, "this is not costume jewelry. This is a genuine diamond of exceptional quality, and unless I'm very much mistaken, it has a rather extraordinary history." The silence in the store was deafening. Sandra's mouth was literally hanging open, and Craig looked like he had just been slapped. Harold's revelation hit the group like a physical blow. Sandra was the first to recover her voice, but instead of her usual confident tone, she sounded shaky and uncertain. "That's impossible," she said. "We've already had it examined by 2 professional jewelers tonight, and they both said it was fake. Are you sure you're not making a mistake?" Craig stepped forward, his earlier smugness replaced by bewilderment. "Sir, with all due respect, these other places seemed pretty confident about their assessment. How can 3 professionals come to such different conclusions?" Kevin had put away his phone entirely and was staring at the ring on Harold's workbench as if it might suddenly sprout wings and fly away. Harold nodded patiently. "I understand your skepticism, and frankly, I don't blame the other jewelers for their assessment. This is a very unusual piece, and without the proper equipment and experience, it would be easy to misidentify." He gestured toward his workstation, which I now noticed was filled with sophisticated-looking instruments and tools. "I've been specializing in antique and estate jewelry for over 40 years, and I've had extensive training in identifying historical pieces." He picked up the ring again and held it under the powerful lamp. "Look at this more carefully," he said, inviting us to gather around his workbench. "The cut of this diamond is very specific. It's what we call an old European cut, which was popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The proportions are different from modern diamonds, which is why it doesn't sparkle in the way people expect contemporary stones to behave." Under Harold's specialized lighting, the stone did indeed look completely different from how it had appeared in the previous stores. Instead of looking like clear glass, it now displayed a complex pattern of light and shadow that created an almost hypnotic effect. The facets seemed to capture and reflect light in ways that were definitely not characteristic of glass or cubic zirconia. Harold continued his explanation, pointing out details that had been invisible to the naked eye. "The setting is also historically significant. This type of silverwork was characteristic of a very specific period and region. The craftsmanship is exceptional, with hand-engraved details that would have taken weeks to complete." He handed me a jeweler's loupe so I could see the intricate patterns carved into the metal around the stone. "But what really caught my attention," Harold said, "were these tiny markings inside the band." He showed us microscopic engravings that were completely invisible without magnification. "These are hallmarks that were used by a very exclusive group of jewelers who worked exclusively for European nobility in the late 19th century. Sandra had been listening to this explanation with increasing agitation. Okay, but even if it's old and well made, that doesn't necessarily mean it's worth a fortune, right? I mean, there are lots of antique pieces that have historical interest, but aren't particularly valuable. She seemed desperate to maintain some version of her original assessment. Harold disappeared into his back room again, and returned with a thick reference book that looked like it weighed 20 pounds. He flipped through several sections before finding what he was looking for. "This is where things get really interesting," he said, pointing to a page filled with photographs and detailed descriptions. "I specialize in jewelry that belonged to European royal families, and I maintain extensive records of pieces that have been lost or stolen over the years." He showed us a photograph of a ring that looked remarkably similar to Eleanor's, though the picture was black and white and somewhat grainy. This ring belonged to Princess Victoria Adelaide of Schleswig-Holstein, a minor member of the British royal family in the late 1800s. It was part of a matching set that included a necklace and earrings, all featuring diamonds from a mine in South Africa that was owned exclusively by the Crown. The silence in the store was so complete that I could hear the ticking of an antique clock on Harold's desk. Craig cleared his throat nervously. "Are you saying that Margaret's ring belonged to a princess?" His voice had lost all of its earlier authority and confidence. Harold nodded gravely. "That's exactly what I'm saying. According to my records, this entire jewelry set disappeared in 1923 during a scandal involving the princess's lady-in-waiting. The official story was that the pieces were stolen, but there were always rumors that they had been given away as payment for silence about certain indiscretions within the royal household." I found my voice for the first time since Harold had begun his examination. "My grandmother Eleanor worked as a domestic servant before she came to America. She always said she had worked for wealthy families in England, but she never talked about the details." The pieces of Eleanor's mysterious past were finally starting to come together in a way that made sense. Harold smiled sympathetically. "Your grandmother was very wise to keep that information to herself. Even today, there would be legal complications surrounding jewelry that left the royal collection under questionable circumstances. By treating it as a simple family heirloom, she protected both herself and her descendants from potentially serious problems." Kevin spoke up for the first time in several minutes. "So what does this mean in practical terms? I mean, what would something like this be worth?" His question was the one that everyone was thinking, but hadn't dared to ask directly. Harold considered the question carefully before answering. "Conservative estimate, based on the quality of the diamond and the historical significance, would be somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 at auction. If we could definitively prove the royal provenance, it could potentially sell for twice that amount." The impact of Harold's valuation was immediate and dramatic. Sandra literally stumbled backward and had to grab onto a display case to steady herself. Her face had gone completely white, and for the first time since I had known her, she was completely speechless. Craig made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a choking noise, and Kevin just stood there with his mouth open like a fish out of water. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. The numbers Harold had mentioned were so far beyond my comprehension that they didn't seem real. My monthly salary was less than $3,000, which meant that this ring was worth more than 5 years of my income. The financial struggles that had been keeping me awake at night suddenly seemed completely absurd. Harold seemed to understand the shock we were all experiencing. "I know this is a lot to process," he said gently. "This kind of discovery doesn't happen very often, even in my line of work. You should take some time to think about what you want to do with this information." Sandra finally found her voice, but it sounded completely different from her usual confident tone. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I mean, obviously I was completely wrong about everything. I feel terrible about what I said earlier." Her apology sounded sincere, but there was something desperate in her eyes that made me uncomfortable. Craig was nodding vigorously. "Yes, absolutely. Margaret, I hope you understand that we were just trying to be helpful. I mean, we had no way of knowing that it was actually valuable. You're not upset with us, are you?" His concern for my feelings was touching, though I couldn't help but notice that it hadn't existed a few hours earlier, when he was encouraging everyone to mock my grandmother's ring. For the first time all evening, I felt like I was in control of the situation. The ring that had been the source of so much embarrassment and ridicule was now making my coworkers scramble to repair relationships they had damaged with their casual cruelty. I looked around at their anxious faces and realized that I had a choice to make about how to respond to their sudden change in attitude. "Well," I said slowly, enjoying the way they all leaned forward to hear what I was going to say, "I guess this means I should take Craig's advice about investing in real jewelry." The irony of the statement wasn't lost on anyone, and I could see Craig wince slightly at having his own words thrown back at him. Kevin tried to laugh, but it came out as more of a nervous cough. Yeah, I guess you're all set in the jewelry department now. He paused awkwardly before adding, so what are you going to do? I mean, are you planning to sell it or keep it or what? The question was obviously on everyone's mind, but I wasn't ready to share my thoughts with people who had spent the evening trying to humiliate me. I need to think about it, I said simply. This is all pretty overwhelming, and I want to make sure I handle everything properly. Harold had been watching our interaction with interest. Miss, if you don't mind my saying so, you should definitely consult with a lawyer before making any major decisions. There are tax implications to consider, as well as insurance and security concerns. This isn't the kind of thing you want to rush into. Sandra jumped at the opportunity to be helpful. Margaret, I know a really good attorney who specializes in estate planning. I could get you his contact information if you want. Her eagerness to assist was almost comical, considering that a few hours earlier, she had been gleefully explaining how my grandmother had been scammed by jewelry con artists. I thanked Harold for his time and expertise, and he carefully placed my ring in a small velvet box. You should get this properly insured as soon as possible, he advised, and I'd recommend having it examined by at least one other specialist to confirm my assessment. I'm confident in my evaluation, but with something this significant, you want to be absolutely certain. As we prepared to leave the store, the dynamic within our group had completely shifted. Instead of being the object of condescending amusement, I was now the center of respectful attention. Sandra held the door open for me, Craig offered to give me a ride home, and Kevin asked if I needed help with anything. Their sudden courtesy felt hollow and manipulative, but I accepted it graciously while privately noting who had shown their true character when they thought I had nothing of value. The drive home was surreal. Craig had insisted on driving me, probably hoping to continue the conversation about the ring and what I planned to do with it. He kept glancing at me nervously while making awkward attempts at small talk. So Margaret, this has been quite an evening, hasn't it? I mean, who would have thought? His laugh sounded forced and uncomfortable. I spent most of the drive looking out the window and thinking about Eleanor. All those stories she had told me about her life in England suddenly seemed less like fantasy and more like carefully edited versions of the truth. I wondered what other secrets she had kept, and whether there were more surprises waiting to be discovered among her few remaining possessions. When I got home to my tiny studio apartment, I sat on my bed and stared at the velvet box Harold had given me. The ring looked exactly the same as it had that morning when I put it on, but everything about my relationship to it had changed. What had been a simple memorial to my grandmother was now a treasure that could transform my entire life. The next few days at work were uncomfortable in ways I hadn't anticipated. Word had spread quickly through the office about what had happened at the jewelry store, and suddenly, everyone wanted to be my friend. Sandra brought me coffee every morning and complimented my outfits. Craig stopped by my desk regularly to ask how I was doing and whether I needed help with anything. Kevin even suggested that I might be ready for more responsibility and a possible promotion. Their transparent attempts to curry favor with me were both amusing and disgusting. I realized that none of these people had ever valued me as a person. They had simply dismissed me as unimportant because I didn't have money or status symbols. Now that they believed I had access to wealth, they were falling all over themselves to be nice to me. But the most significant change was in how I saw myself. For years, I had accepted other people's assessments of my worth and had internalized their casual dismissal of my value. I had allowed Sandra's opinions about my clothes and Craig's condescending advice about professionalism to make me feel inadequate and ashamed. The discovery of the ring's true value hadn't actually changed anything about who I was as a person, but it had given me permission to see myself differently. I began to realize that I had been living my life according to other people's standards and expectations, constantly seeking approval from people whose opinions weren't worth having. I scheduled appointments with both a lawyer and an insurance agent to discuss my options regarding the ring. The lawyer confirmed Harold's advice about the complexity of dealing with jewelry that had potentially questionable provenance. The insurance agent nearly fell out of his chair when I told him the estimated value of the piece I wanted to insure. More importantly, I began to research Eleanor's background more thoroughly. I contacted relatives I hadn't spoken to in years and reached out to genealogy services to learn more about her life before she came to America. What I discovered was fascinating and heartbreaking in equal measure. Eleanor had indeed worked for aristocratic families in England, and she had left the country rather suddenly in the mid-1940s, under circumstances that no one in the family had ever fully understood. Through old immigration records and ship manifests, I was able to piece together a story of a young woman who had been trusted with valuable items by her employer and had chosen to disappear, rather than return them, when scandal threatened to destroy the family she worked for. Eleanor had protected both herself and her employers by taking their secrets with her to America, where she had lived quietly and modestly for the rest of her life. I also made the decision to resign from my job at the marketing firm. I had been unhappy there for months, but I had stayed because I was afraid of taking risks, and because I didn't believe I deserved anything better. The ring hadn't made me wealthy yet, but it had given me the confidence to bet on myself in ways I never had before. 3 months after that fateful dinner, my life had changed in ways that went far beyond financial considerations. I had decided not to sell Eleanor's ring, at least not immediately. Instead, I had it professionally cleaned and reset in a more secure mounting, and I continued to wear it every day as a reminder of both my grandmother's strength and my own worth. I found a new job at a larger marketing firm that paid nearly double my previous salary and treated employees with respect rather than condescension. The interviewing process had been completely different from any I had experienced before. Instead of feeling desperate and grateful for any opportunity, I had approached each meeting with confidence and clear expectations about what I wanted from an employer. Harold and I had developed an unlikely friendship. He had introduced me to other collectors and historians who were fascinated by Eleanor's story and the ring's connection to British royal history. Through these connections, I had learned about a whole community of people who shared interests in genealogy, antique jewelry, and historical research. I had also begun the process of researching Eleanor's family history more systematically. With the help of professional genealogists and historians, I was uncovering details about her life that painted a picture of a woman who had been much more adventurous and resourceful than I had ever imagined. There were hints that Eleanor's ring might not be the only valuable item she had brought with her from England, and I was slowly going through her few remaining possessions with new eyes. My relationship with my former coworkers had evolved in predictable ways. Sandra continued to try to maintain our friendship, but her efforts felt calculated and insincere. She would text me regularly with invitations to lunch or shopping trips, always mentioning how much she missed having me around the office. Craig had actually asked me out on a date, apparently forgetting that he had spent months treating me like an incompetent child. Kevin had been the most honest in his approach. He had called me a few weeks after I resigned to apologize for his part in the evening's events, and to acknowledge that he had underestimated me as both a person and a professional. His apology felt genuine, and we had maintained a cordial relationship that was based on mutual respect rather than the power dynamics that had defined our previous interactions. The most profound change, however, was in how I understood my relationship with Eleanor and with my own family history. For most of my life, I had seen myself as someone who came from nothing and had no particular advantages or connections. I had accepted the idea that I was destined for a modest, unremarkable life, because that seemed to be all that my background had prepared me for. Eleanor's ring had revealed that my family story was much more complex and interesting than I had ever known. More importantly, it had shown me that Eleanor herself had been a woman of courage and intelligence, who had navigated difficult circumstances with grace and determination. These were qualities that I was beginning to recognize in myself, traits that had been there all along but had been obscured by years of self-doubt and external criticism. I had also begun to understand that Eleanor's decision to keep the ring's true nature secret had been an act of protection not just for herself, but for me as well. She had known that growing up with the knowledge of having something so valuable would have changed how I saw myself and how others saw me. By allowing me to discover the truth on my own terms, as an adult capable of handling the responsibility, she had given me a gift that went far beyond the ring's monetary worth. The experience had taught me that value isn't always visible on the surface, and that the most precious things in life are often disguised as ordinary objects or experiences. Eleanor's ring had looked like costume jewelry to everyone who saw it, but it had contained secrets and stories that were far more valuable than its impressive appraisal price. I had learned to trust my own instincts and to value my own opinions above the casual judgments of people who didn't really know me. The evening at Harold's jewelry store had been a turning point, but not because it had made me wealthy. It had been transformative because it had forced me to confront how much of my self-worth I had been allowing other people to define. Most importantly, I had discovered that Eleanor's greatest gift to me wasn't the ring itself, but the example she had set of how to live with dignity and grace, regardless of circumstances. She had faced challenges and opportunities that I was only beginning to understand, and she had handled them with a quiet strength that I was learning to emulate in my own life. As I look back on that strange evening now, I realize that Sandra, Craig, and Kevin had actually done me a favor by insisting that we get the ring appraised. Their mockery and condescension had been cruel, but it had led me to discover truths about myself and my family that I might never have uncovered otherwise. Sometimes the most transformative experiences come disguised as moments of humiliation or defeat. I still wear Eleanor's ring every day, not because of its financial value, but because it reminds me that appearances can be deceiving, and that the most important treasures in life are often hidden in plain sight. Every time I look at it, I remember that I am the granddaughter of a woman who was braver and more resourceful than I ever imagined, and that I carry her strength with me wherever I go. The ring taught me that true value isn't always obvious, and that the opinions of people who judge based on appearances are usually worth exactly as much as they seem to be. Eleanor's gift to me wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was the knowledge that I am worthy of respect and capable of much more than I had ever dared to believe. And sometimes, when I catch the light just right, I swear I can see Eleanor smiling back at me from within the stone's brilliant depths, proud that her secret has finally found its way home. What family heirlooms do you have that might hold secrets you've never discovered? Have you ever had people judge something you treasured based purely on appearances? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please give this video a like if Eleanor's story touched your heart, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible real-life tales that prove truth really is stranger than fiction. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that their worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most precious gifts come in the most unexpected packages. Until next time, keep looking for the hidden treasures in your own life.